Hello and welcome to Band Literature Reviews with Brandon Searles. Band Literature Reviews is a series that evaluates concert band music from the perspective of a small school director. This is episode 6, Back in Time. In today's show, I'll discuss 3 pieces of concert band literature: Red River Valley, Ancient Voices, and The Curse of Tutankhamun. I hope you enjoy this discussion today. Welcome back to another episode, everybody. I'm glad to have you on board again. I hope your guys' year is wrapping up well. As of the time of recording this, I am just about 3 or 4 weeks out from the end of school, and I am really looking forward to it. It's that really tough time of the year. I don't know about all of you out there, but for me, it's really just the last push with state testing and getting ready for our final concert, and everything wrapped up in that. Hopefully it's not too crazy for all of you out there listening. For today's episode, as I said, we're going to be going back in time. There's a historical theme to the pieces that we are listening to today, and I think it'll be very enjoyable to look at some of the very unique modalities and unique percussion, especially in these following pieces that we're going to listen to. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into our first piece, which is The Red River Valley by Pierre Laplante. Alright, hello again everybody. Here are some of the details about The Red River Valley by Pierre Laplante. As I said, it's called The Red River Valley, composed by Pierre Laplante. The key signatures included in this are B flat major and E flat major, 2 flats and 3 flats respectively. The genre or style is a lyrical folk song. The grade level is listed at 1.5 to 2, as you saw in the graphic. It is 3 minutes almost exactly in length and 35 measures, which is quite short. The publisher is Dane Publications. It was composed in the year 2001, and the single tempo in this is 64 beats per minute. Here's a little bit of information about Pierre Laplante. He is an American composer who has spent a number of years as a high school band teacher. He taught some beginning band as well towards the end of his career. He is still active as a bassoonist, composer, and adjudicator, and he has had a specialty in rescoring and arranging lots of folk songs, including this one, of course. As it says in the graphic, the grade level of this piece is 1.5 to 2, and I'm glad it gives a range because it gives a good amount of perspective to band directors like you and I that are looking at pieces of music and thinking, is this something our group can manage? And sometimes you can't really get all that information in just a number, and that's the reason for me doing this YouTube channel as well. I would say overall, as with any other lyrical piece that I've been reviewing and looking at and listening to and recommending, it tends to be towards the harder side of that musical grade level. So I'm going to say it feels more like a 2. And really getting our bands to, number one, just play lyrical pieces. I don't know about all of you, but my band doesn't really like playing lyrical stuff. And it's, number one, just getting them to play it, and then number two, getting them to play it well, and understanding all these nuances that we take for granted as music educators. That's a bit of what I think about as far as the grade level of this piece, with it being a lyrical piece. The instrumentation on it, there's 2 of pretty much every instrument, although Pierre states in the score notes that the divisi are not necessary and can be used whenever feasible based on skill or numbers. So the way that he scored this is with possibly smaller or less skilled bands in mind, thus the range of grade level rating and such. In this piece, euphonium and French horn are definite must-have instruments. The oboe, however, copies either the flute or the clarinet most all the time, so it's not an essential standalone instrument that you have to have, otherwise don't try it. It's very flexible in that sense. The percussion parts are very sparse. I've not seen this few percussion in hardly any of the pieces I've looked at thus far for this show or for my own perusal and programming in the 7 years I've been teaching now. As far as the ranges and challenges are concerned, the first clarinet, as is traditional with these grade levels, the first clarinet is over the break, the second is not. The horn part is very difficult for a beginner, and there are lots of moving parts, and the slow tempo with these moving parts will challenge a lot of more inexperienced groups. There are a lot of intervals and jumps in the melody, and that could end up being pretty tricky, and there are points in time that you probably heard that the French horn carries the melody. That makes it definitely a lot harder to be able to manage. As far as ranges for the brass, the trumpet part goes up to a D in the staff, not too bad. The horn part goes up to a D in the staff as well, a lot harder to do on French horn than on trumpet. The euphonium part is tricky, but it could be something that, say, a trumpet switched over to euphonium could play pretty well, because if you have a trumpet player that's in 7th, 8th grade that's become pretty familiar with the instrument, they could switch over and be able to play a lot of these lyrical passages that are more indicative of maybe a high school group and be able to not be intimidated by that. So that said, that would be my recommendation. If you don't have a euphonium player, you could switch a trumpet player, and I think they would have a decent amount of success, as long as this wasn't like right after they switched. As far as rhythms and percussion challenges are concerned, there's nothing too tricky in this. There are lots of moving eighth notes, sure, and there are a few different articulations that are necessary to make it flow smoothly and be accurate to the style. Overall, it's not too much out of the question for most groups. The percussion parts that are present are a timpani part, a bells part, and a suspended cymbal part. This is very basic and could even end up being quite boring for your percussion, especially if you have a larger percussion section. Everybody playing the same part could end up making it pretty hard for them. There are some offbeat entrances on the end of 1 and on the end of 3 that are pretty important to get rhythmically accurate, especially at this slow tempo. And that could end up being a challenge for, say, some 6th graders and maybe even 7th graders, depending on their rhythmic literacy level. There are differing rhythms in almost all like instrument parts. For example, the first and second clarinet part, first clarinets are doing something rhythmically different than the seconds. And the same thing with like alto sax, with the trumpet 1 and 2. There's not a lot of moving together happening, which adds another layer of complexity to the piece and makes it so that your players need to have a little bit more part independence to be able to accomplish it. Moving on to my overall recommendation, I would say yes, this would be a good one to approach for a variety of reasons. Those keys to success include your group should definitely have some experience playing lyrical pieces. This would not be the best first lyrical piece that you put in front of your group. And odds are you're probably not at this point if you're programming a grade 1.5, 2 lyrical piece. I just wanted to put that warning out there because it could be pretty challenging to the point of not being a good choice if your group is not very experienced with lyrical playing. You're going to need to have a very confident French horn section, uncommonly good. The melody is pretty difficult, and the French horns have it at least 2 times during this piece, if not more. You need to obviously have 1 or more clarinets that can cross the break confidently. You need to have a euphonium, and then, funnily enough, you need to have a limited percussion section, which in small schools most of the time is not a problem, and we look for pieces like this. You definitely need to have 3 or 4 percussionists or less to be able to do this piece and not have people sitting out. Let's go ahead and move on to our second piece. That piece was Ancient Voices, composed by Michael Sweeney. The key signature is G minor, so 2 flats in the key signature, and the style of this is thematic. It is a grade level 3, as it's listed. It is 3 minutes and 45 seconds long, and 89 measures. The publisher is the Hal Leonard Corporation, published in the year 1994. The tempos in this are 76 and 152 beats per minute, which I actually want to make a mention on that. This and the next piece that we are listening to have this in common, where the 2 tempos in this piece are exactly double time and exactly half time of each other, which I think is a very ingenious way of going about tempo changes, and makes it so that the director, number one, can get an accurate tempo at the tempo change for inexperienced directors, and so that the band can internalize that pulse and not have to guess as much on the tempo. So it's literally just switching from 1, 2, 3, 4 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and makes that transition a lot easier. Now, that being said, here's some information about Michael Sweeney. He should be a name that you've probably heard about at this point in time. He's done so many pieces of music, and especially arrangements, for all types of ensembles, for concert bands, pep bands, marching bands, jazz bands, pretty much everything, and has some very wonderful arrangements of a variety of pieces, and I've played a lot of his stuff. I really like Michael Sweeney. Once again, has a lot of great stuff out there. The grade level of this, I would say, is definitely accurate. It's a different tonality, as I mentioned in the key signature. There's a lot of effectual playing, meaning creating certain sound effects with the instruments and not only with the percussion. And once again, there's lots of distinct percussion parts in this. So your percussionists are going to get a variety of different instruments that they get to have experience with, which could be a big draw for you doing this piece. As far as the instrumentation is concerned, this is part of one of the small score series that Hal Leonard came out with back then in the 90s. The small score series basically makes it so that the score is condensed, but not to the point of being a fully condensed score, where it'll combine certain parts to make it so that the score is easier to read, and makes it so that there are 2 systems per page as opposed to just 1 system per page. This also means that the instrumentation is a lot more manageable and is not written for a super diverse instrumentation in your band. This makes it a pretty good go-to for small schools, at least like mine. The next part of this is, as you heard in there were some recorders. And this isn't your everyday elementary music 3rd grade recorder stuff. This is a little bit more complicated than that, and definitely makes it not a walk in the park. But it's still manageable, I would say. And this is coming from, once again, somebody who teaches all levels of music, so I'm familiar with teaching recorders. There's also singing present in the instrumentation on just relaxed, open 5th Oz. There are pencils on the stands. I've come across one other piece that does that as well, but it's a really cool effect that you can create without having to get a bunch of expensive instruments. In fact, you can get a box of pencils from your staff room and be set to go on this. There are roughly 4 percussion parts on this. There's castanets, wind chimes, suspended cymbal, toms, triangle, and bells. There are 2 clarinet parts, 2 trumpet parts, and 1 of everything else, which once again, that small score series makes it much more manageable. There's an optional French horn part, which if you're so small that you don't have a French horn, or you just don't have the funding to have a French horn, that is not a requirement in this piece. The other interesting instrumentation challenge that you might have noticed is there are straight mutes called for in the trumpets. It's listed as optional, but as far as I'm concerned, when I choose pieces, I want to be able to emulate the style as much as possible, and I feel like it's a little more make or break than saying just optional. I would say probably recommended, but not required. And me personally, I would definitely go for that the best I possibly could to achieve that effect. Lastly, there are up to 3 divisi in the clarinet part between the 1st and 2nd clarinet. So you will need to have 3 clarinets to be able to do this accurately. And that's in some of those like cluster chords, the bell tones stacked on top of each other at the very beginning. To be able to achieve that effect properly, you need to be having those 3 clarinet parts. As far as the ranges and challenges are concerned, the recorder part, it is mostly diatonic. However, there is the random D flat thrown in there. And from my experience with recorder and with saxophone and flute, that is actually an easier note than most because it's the open, nothing down fingering. However, it's really bad intonation, as you guys probably know, with the flute and the alto sax especially. And the same holds true for that recorder as well. So getting that pitch to center in and have good intonation is going to be a bit tricky. So you'll want to have flute players that switch over to that and are able to make that adjustment and have good listening skills to be able to tell when they're in tune or not. Once again, as we were getting used to, 1 clarinet goes over the break, 1 clarinet does not. The trumpets range goes up to a high E, still in the staff. The singing in the open fifths, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge because it's not played in the parts right before that. And I found that with most solely instrumentalists, that's going to be harder when they don't have that backing to be able to sing to. It's just being able to hear where the tonality is, which once again, it's not the easiest tonality to be able to adapt one's ear to. Of course, we as music teachers have gotten used to all sorts of different tonalities and stuff like that, but our bands, not so much. Singing in this would definitely be a challenge, and if you decide to do this, your singers that are also instrumentalists have had some singing experience before this, and this isn't the first time that they're having to sing in a band piece. The other challenge of this is there's lots of dissonance, and developing an ear for dissonance is really hard to do. It's one thing if your band can hear the tonality and the consonant chords and stuff like that in pieces of music. It's another step entirely for them to be able to hear the dissonance and not shy away from it and play it as it's intended to be. And then lastly, as I've continued to mention, the foreign tonality really does affect things as well and would be an interesting challenge for a lot of groups, I would say. Moving on to the rhythms and the percussion. There's a lot of very specific info for the percussion, such as the type of mallet to use, whether the snares are off or on, where on the drum head they're supposed to hit it, and a bunch of other stuff like that. Michael Sweeney here in this case is definitely giving the percussionists a little bit more attention than most composers give, which is great. It's just a bit foreign to us as band directors though, because I don't know about all of you. Every percussion part I've seen, out of all of them, there are only like 1 or 2 composers I know that even consistently do this. The only other one is James Swearingen in a piece that my 6th grade band performed fairly recently. But that's another story. The next difficulty is there's a snare drum part that's really, really tricky at the tempo change. And you'll see the notation of that right above me here in just a moment. And being able to figure out the sticking of this and the interesting accent pattern, it's definitely going to challenge one of your snare drummers to be able to do this pattern. It's kind of funny, when I first listened to this piece, it almost sounded like a conga line, and I was thinking, that would be interesting to have conga drums do that pattern instead of the snare drum, but that's just an extra thing. However, one way or another, the sticking or the hand pattern to be able to get those accents to line up correctly is definitely not going to be easy. So taking a look at that line once again, that's right above me here. Then the last part of rhythms and percussion challenges is there are lots of parts that are on a unison rhythm. If somebody messes up, it could be really bad. The pencil click on the stands, the very exposed brass lines at the tempo change. If anybody is the slightest bit off or just guesses, it's going to be very noticeable. Moving on to my recommendation, I would say, yeah, a small school could definitely do this if your group's playing level is advanced enough overall. That's the caveat, of course. Here are the keys to success that you want to look for in your band to be able to perform this. You're going to have a really good percussion section. Each part is pretty challenging in and of itself. There's no real easy percussion part. I could Definitely see my group doing this in a few years with my percussionists sticking around. If these sixth grade percussionists of mine continue to mature together, I think we could tackle this piece. If we can keep the more or less same core group, that would really help things out. The next key to success would be having singers in each section that already know how to sing. An idea with this would be to pull a choir in from either a colleague or yourself. In my case, I teach both the band and the choir, so I already know who my singers are. And I would definitely lean on them and say, hey, help your section out with learning this, because I can't teach to sing with good technique and effectively and on pitch and accurately. And having that resource in place would definitely help. So if you're in a small school as small as mine and you're the choir teacher as well, maybe you got this figured out and handled, and that's not much of a challenge. But for other situations where you're just a band teacher or band and elementary teacher, this might be a little bit out of your comfort zone potentially. You're going to need to have players that know a lot of the not as normal or alternate fingering notes. Like I said, there are some interesting valve combinations. There are some very interesting notes on clarinet, especially. There's that D flat on the recorder and / the flute that is really tricky to, number one, get the fingering for, and number two, to play it in tune and correctly. And then, of course, I keep alluding to the recorder part. You need to know how to teach recorder. If you have never picked up a recorder since you were in 3rd or 4th grade, probably not the time to this time. I mean, I'm sure you could probably pick it up, but it would be a lot of extra work on your part. Be sure that you know how to teach this recorder part before you commit to the piece. The mutes, I would say, are fairly important. I personally wouldn't do it without the mutes, so you need to have those straight mutes or at least have access to them. There are plenty of ways to problem solve that. I would say definitely have the mutes because it's a really cool effect, and I feel like it would be kind of lacking without it. And then lastly, your group is going to need to have some pretty good rhythmic literacy, and as a band, be able to manage some of these more difficult rhythms, like I said. That's everything I have on Ancient Voices by Michael Sweeney. Let's go ahead and move on to our last piece. welcome back. Thanks for listening. This was The Curse of Tutankhamun by Michael Story. It's in the key signature of G minor, 2 flats, and the genre or style is thematic. It's grade level 2 on the cover. It's 2 minutes 45 seconds long in performance, and the tempos are 74 beats per minute and 148 beats per minute. Publisher is Bellwin Incorporated, and it was published in the year 2001. Once again, as I mentioned before, the tempos are exact doublings of each other and exact halves of each other. So once again, really easy transitions there. Very, very well done by these two composers, and such a great idea. Now, speaking of the composer, this is Michael Story, like I mentioned. He has a very similar biography to Michael Sweeney. He's written a lot of different pieces for a remarkable number of band ensembles out there. Once again, field show band, pep band, marching band, concert band, jazz band. He's present in all of these subgenres of band music. The grade level of this piece, I would say it's a bit harder than a 2. There's a lot of chromatic notes in especially the flute and the clarinet. And there are definitely some range aspects that make this quite significant for a middle school group. The instrumentation for this are 2 clarinets, 2 trumpets, and 1 of everything else. There is 1 horn part, but all of the important parts on the horn have cues in the alto sax. The percussion has a bells and xylophone mallet percussion part, so you need to have both of those. It has parts for 2 timpani drums, a snare drum, bass drum, gong, suspended cymbal, shaker, and toms. And I would say around 6 percussionists would be good to fully instrument this. Once again, this is one of those really, really nice and awesome percussion pieces that if your percussion loves to have fun, they're going to eat this piece up and really enjoy it. The last part of the instrumentation is that there's a separate baritone part. As far as ranges and challenges are concerned, mode of the piece is in minor or Phrygian, which gives that ancient Egyptian vibe that a lot of pieces kind of program towards. It's still very enjoyable overall. However, there is still a challenge in that tonality. Another challenge is the trombones have glisses. That's very exciting. Trombone glisses make life so much more fun. It's one thing to be able to just do it messing around. It's another thing entirely for the music to have it written in. However, to be able to do it right isn't always the easiest thing. Moving on, the first clarinet part, once again, is over the break. The second is not. This is one of the things that I don't think Michael Story did well on the subject of the clarinets. He wrote in, towards the end, right there at the measure marker 73, this ridiculous scale in the clarinet part. The fingering for this on clarinet is absolutely bonkers for a middle school player. It has several alternate fingerings, and you have to use both left and right side pinkies on this. The fingering for this is E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, F. That is an absolutely ridiculous scale to be able to do, or run to be able to do. It's, for me as a clarinet player that's pretty accomplished, I love seeing fun stuff like that, but for a middle school clarinet player, they're going to look at that and just say, how in the heck am I supposed to do this? And unless you're a clarinet player, you're going to have to really study your fingerings to be able to do that correctly, or just rewind this clip a bunch of times and memorize what I just showed. There's also a few trills that are notated as a flat trill as opposed to a whole step. So half step trill instead of whole step trill. Those can get kind of tricky to explain to woodwind players, and that's usually where we enter the realm of awkward alternate fingerings that some, if not most, band directors are not super familiar with unless they are actually native clarinet or flute players. Then lastly, the trumpets get up to an F on top of the staff, and this is definitely getting up towards the higher end of a middle school group's playing level as far as range is concerned. To be able to play consistently and accurately, not super easy. Moving on to rhythms and percussion. There is a decent amount of syncopation, and there's a lot of unison rhythmic figures. There's the part that, once again, I'll pop this up above my head. The rhythmic figure of the da-da-dum-da-dum and the interesting unison legato lines make it so that these unique rhythms that are spread out through a lot of parts leave little room for error. There's also a number of times where the timpani has to switch tuning. This is a challenging thing for a middle school percussionist to do. You're going to have a percussionist that has tuned timpani before and is pretty confident in doing that. I know right now I have one that might be able to pull that off. That would definitely be a challenge and definitely would dissuade me from wanting to do this piece otherwise. There are also a lot of really quiet rolls in the snare drum that are sustained for quite a while. It's not just a quick, short whole note roll. It's like, over 2 or 3 measures and a very slow and gradual crescendo on it, which is really, really hard to be able to master. There are lots of offbeat, low rhythms in the lower instrument parts, the bass voices and stuff like that. And then there are the repeated slurred ostinati in the clarinets. However, those ones are actually not all that hard. And one of the very ingenious things that Michael Story does in this is the run that he has clarinets doing below the break is the same fingerings up above the break when it switches tonality slightly. The clarinets theoretically only have to learn only one interesting fingering pattern for this, and it's actually not all that bad. It's all only in the right hand. And once again, most band directors probably wouldn't notice this unless they're clarinet players. And it makes it actually really easy because all the movement is in the right hand. If you're getting both hands moving and having to do a lot of switching between left, right, and putting fingers down and lifting fingers up on opposite hands, yeah, that gets harder, but it's all in the right hand for the most part and stepwise. So those interesting legato, slurred clarinet ostinati are actually not as hard as they look. Moving on to my recommendation on this. I would say yes, putting a question mark on the end there. It would definitely be a stretch in some ways, and there are some challenges that might not be able to be overcome by some, if not most, smaller schools. And that being said, the keys to success is, number one, you need to have some really, really good woodwind players, or be really good at teaching woodwinds. You're going to need to have some students who will agree to go home and practice this, because there's just so much to teach in here that you're not going to be able to spoon feed it to them and keep coming back to it, and eventually they get it, kind of thing. One other thing, like a pro tip that I use, I do like to give students the modal scale for whatever piece that we're doing. I've written it out for the Tempest, for example, in G minor. I gave them the concert G minor scale to go home and practice with and use as a warm-up. I am also doing Pirates of the Caribbean, which is in concert F minor. There's an awesome flex arrangement that I'm doing for our end of the year concert, but once again, another story. I will send home the modal scale of that particular piece for them to practice so that they can get that tonality under their fingers a lot easier. The next key to success is you've got to have a flute. There are a couple of flute, basically solos, or solis at the very least, that it would not be the piece that it is without that flute part. I know a lot about this piece because I thought about actually doing this at our end of the year concert, but I realized that this was beyond my current group. Like I said, everybody's group is different. You know your group's strengths, and hopefully with the information I give you, you can make an informed decision on that. The last few things are your group needs to have experience with syncopation, and you're going to need to have some solid percussion, most specifically the snare drum player, because it is a giddy up, fun, hard snare drum part all the way throughout, and lots of exposed moments where you very clearly hear the snare drum, as you heard in the recording. That's everything that I have for you guys on these pieces. I hope you guys have a great rest of your year. I will see you in my next upcoming video. Thanks again, everybody, for coming and listening and watching. This is BandLitReviews by Brandon Searles. I'm a K-12 music teacher in Washington State. You can find my information below on the YouTube channel there, BandLitReviews. You can find my channel. And if you want to email me, it is bandlitreviews, as you see on the screen, @gmail.com. If you have any suggestions about pieces I should do as I'm wrapping up with my project, please feel free to email me or drop a comment. Once again, thank you for listening and for your support. We'll see you in the next episode.